Before listening to this sermon, if you could please read James chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. I don't know if you've ever noticed that James is always straight to the point. If we need to be told that something is dangerously wrong, he'll not drop hints quietly. He'll shout it in our face. And so immediately in verse 1, James is straight to the point and warns us about the greatest danger of them all. Now listen, you rich. The danger that has the greatest potential to lead you and I astray is not listening. Now listen, you rich. Note that James doesn't tell the rich to become poor. In fact, in verse 11, James describes Job positively. Job being somebody in the Bible who is described as the greatest man of his day from a financial perspective. James tells the rich not to become poor, but to listen. Riches had caused the people he was writing to ignore some really important biblical truths. We see this not listening happening in verse 11. James writes, "You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter." The danger of a life of luxury and self-indulgence is not just a fat belly, it's a fat heart. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. James isn't talking about our physical hearts and our risk of cardiovascular disease. James is talking about the heart as the centre of our emotions, the centre of our feelings and thinking. A person with a heart of stone ignores the feelings of others. A person with a calloused heart doesn't listen and doesn't care. The meaning of a fat heart is the same. A life focused on luxury and self-indulgence can cause us to become desensitized, ignoring the things that are truly important, not listening to what God's word says, not caring about the things that we should care about. You know, James could have just as easily have said, "Now listen, you who live in a materialistic focused society." Or, "Now listen, you who watch adverts that prioritize you." Now listen, you who have a strong desire for any worldly thing. All of these things can desensitize us, distract us, and cause us to deliberately ignore some majorly important biblical truths. But what truths can these things cause us to ignore? Well, James writes, "You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence." Why does James feel the need to remind us that we live on earth? Surely that is a fact that all of us know. Well, just think, when do you tell somebody that you're from the UK? You tell somebody you're from the UK when you're on holiday, when you're not in the UK, when you're face to face with someone not from the UK. When do you tell somebody that you're from the Northeast? You tell somebody that when you're not in the Northeast, when you're somewhere else in England, when you're face to face with somebody who's not from the same place as you. James reminds us that we currently live on earth because one day we're going to stand face to face with somebody who is not. One day we're going to be stood face to face with the God of heaven, and he's not going to ask us where we live. He's going to ask us how we live. How have we invested our earthly lives? And all of us are going to be called to give an account for how we've lived our earthly lives. Truth 1. that we are all at risk of ignoring is this: we are accountable to God and have a responsibility towards others. You and I are accountable to God and have a responsibility towards others. But this was a fact that the rich in these verses had forgotten. Verse 11, you have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. They had ignored all other priorities that didn't centre around themselves. The wages of the labourers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. They had ignored the needs of others because they were only concerned about their own. The cries of the harvesters that you have defrauded have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. These people were the top man in a big business. They didn't think they were accountable to anybody else. But the truth that these rich people were forgetting was that they were accountable to God and have a responsibility towards others. And this truth can just as easily be forgotten about by us. Now listen, you who watch adverts that focus on material pleasures and entertainment. Don't buy into the lie that these things are what life is all about. Now listen, you who could spend every second watching YouTube, sport and Netflix. Don't put these must-watch things over much more important things. Now listen, you who want the people around you to like you. Remember, you must answer to God and not to them. Now listen, you who live in a society with a low emphasis on morals and integrity. Don't compromise, even if other people approve, even if nobody else sees. Now listen, you who have a little bit more than others. Remember your responsibility to the have-nots. We are accountable to God and have a responsibility towards others. That's truth 1. Now truth 2. Being first in life isn't the most important thing. That might take you as a surprise, because if you had the choice to be first or last in a queue, it's pretty obvious which one you would pick. Everybody knows that being at the front of the queue is the best place to be. Even Percy Pig. Percy Pig loved being at the front of the queue. He'd always make himself first in the queue for a tickle under the chin from Farmer Giles. And after that tickle under the chin, Farmer Giles would even sneak Percy a few giblets. But not just any giblets, first-class giblets. Deep-fried giblets for Farmer Giles's favourite pig. Farmer Giles even made sure Percy was first at the feeding trough, first to be served the chocolate-coated offal before it was all gone. Percy was even first in the village to get an invite to Farmer Giles's hog roast, front row seats. On the day of the hog roast, Percy was the most popular animal at the party, winning a round of applause for his first-class talent, holding a red apple in his mouth over a tray of hot coals. Being first in life isn't the most important thing. In verses 1 to 6, James urges the rich to join Percy in rethinking their view of being first in the queue. Yes, in the moment, being first in the queue might seem like the goal to aim for, but one day it will not. James writes, you have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. The rich had devoted their lives to the first-class experience, enjoying first-class food and first-class clothes, their pleasure being their first priority. But James reminds them that a day was approaching when this first-class life would end, lose all importance, when their misplaced priorities would be exposed. He writes in verse 4, look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. The rich were the first, most important people in the company, so they thought they could ignore the voices of those they trampled over to get rich. But James reminds them that God hears the voice of those last in the queue and will one day hold those over them accountable for their actions. Verse 3, you have hoarded wealth in the last days. They made it their goal to make their pile of treasure the biggest, but their life's purpose would become meaningless in an instant at death. Truth number 2, being first in life isn't the most important thing. I'm going to give a few variations of this. Now listen, you who have access to the top entertainment. Watching every series on Netflix is not actually the most important thing. Now listen, you who have the most disposable income. Spending it on yourself is not the most worthwhile investment. Now listen, you who are the first to compromise in order to gain an advantage. One day that advantage will be meaningless. Now listen, you who are the first to tear others apart, the first to criticize, the first to make yourself noticed. God cares very little for your ego and cares a lot about those that you have hurt. Now listen, you who have the most streaming channels, the most shops, the most alternative ways to use your time, the most opportunity to make your life all about your comfort. Now listen, you who had the most time to pray, the most energy to serve, the most resources to invest in world mission, the most experiences to pass on, the most opportunities to do good. Do you really want to reach the end of your life with this as your badge of honor? I hoarded wealth, I kept things comfortable, I focused on myself, and now I've got nothing to show for it. Do we want that badge of honor as a church? We hoarded wealth, we kept things comfortable, we focused on ourselves, and now we've got nothing to show for it. It's challenging stuff, isn't it? James reminds us that living this type of life is foolish. But the problem I had was this. Living this type of life is normal. It's normal in our society to make my own comfort, my own pleasure, my own satisfaction our main priority. You know, feed me 24 hours of TV adverts, magazine articles, sports bulletins, holiday brochures, and the world's definition of the good life. Give me 24 hours of these things, and I will have stopped listening to what James has just said. So how do you and I make sure we don't just listen now, but keep listening to what James says? What's the solution to the problem of not listening that James describes in verses 1 to 6? Well, the answer is in verses 7 to 11. After telling us to listen, James tells us to look. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop. James wants us to picture the hard-working farmer who waits for his hard work to prove worthwhile. Now, I've never seen a farmer at work, but I've met a lot of farmers when they've been in hospital, where I work as a nurse. And all farmers have this in common. All farmers arrive at hospital with half a field worth of soil under their nails. They may have been unwell for weeks on end, but they kept grafting till the last minute. Some dialed 999 whilst milking a cow. And all farmers' hands are as hard as sandpaper. The hard manual labour has caused their hands to become calloused. And all farmers keep working in hospital. They're always on the phone, making sure the work is still happening, placing orders, making sure that people are doing what they're supposed to do back at the farm. And when you discharge a farmer at 9 p.m, the day after a major operation, farmers will ask for a sick note of 6 hours. They feel they could do with a lion till 5 a.m. the next day. Farming is hard work. And yet, the profits of a farmer go like this. They have lots of money, they buy some seed, bury it under the soil, and then see no returns for several months in a row. They take out all of the money from the bank account in spring, then bury all that cash underground in the form of seed, and they wait and wait and wait and wait with no returns for ages. James asks us to picture Christ-like living as like farming. It can be hard work, and it might not pay off for a long time. It can be hard work living a life of integrity when it gains you no advantage. It can be hard work giving time and resources to gospel work when you don't see the results. It can be hard work investing in people when it costs you time and effort and the cost of caring. It can be hard work suffering and wrestling with unanswered questions. To invest all this effort, like farming, with no return might seem foolish. To live the rich life, well, that makes sense. That's why the only people who become farmers are generally sons of farmers. I don't know if you've noticed that. The only people who are willing to invest all that effort in farming are those who have seen at least 25 harvests where all that effort has paid off. That's why James asks us to spend time with other farmers, the likes of the prophets described in verses 10 and in verse 11. Brothers and sisters, James writes, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count it as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. Think of some of the prophets in the Old Testament and how they invested much for little return, but their investment only paid off later on. For example, Moses could have lived a much more comfortable life in Midian, but he invested in helping God's people in Egypt. And long term, he helped free a nation from slavery. Job could have ripped up his faith in God. It would have been easier than wrestling with all his unanswered questions that he had. But Job persevered, and his faith in God proved worth it. Jeremiah the prophet could have preached a more popular message to make his life easier, but he preached the truth and suffered for it. But it was his words that a lot later gave so many of the Jews in Babylon hope. Abraham could have given up in investing in God's long-term project that would bless the world. He could have focused on his own happiness instead. But Abraham kept investing, and his long-term impact on the world cannot be overstated. If we are going to live the life of a farmer, investing in the long-term projects that God asks us to, the only way we're going to do it is if we spend time with people like these. Spending our time in the scriptures, reminding ourselves about these people whose faith in God paid off. You know, if you spend your time with your head in magazines, adverts, shopping catalogues, holiday brochures, in the clouds, fantasizing about the better life, well, you'll forget all these truths that James has talked about. You'll live for yourself. You'll think that being first in life is what life is all about. But if you spend your time with hard-working farmers, people like the prophets and Job, then it will remind you about these truths. It will remind you to persevere in your faith. It will remind you to invest in God's work and on other people. For this is the life that is truly worth living.